Hi, everyone. This is Jen Grisanti, and this is the Story Therapy podcast interview that I am doing with two guests that I'm very, very excited about. Peter and Jeff have both done my Storywise podcast, and now we are celebrating their new book, which is so perfect for my audience. It's called Pitch Like Hollywood. So this is by Peter Desberg and Jeffery Davis. And let me tell you a little bit about them so that you get an idea. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it to them so they can then introduce themselves like they would introduce themselves in a pitch, because that is what we were going to take a deep dive into in this podcast. So with story therapy, I came up with this angle of looking at story, looking at the psychology of story, and helping us look at story from the inside out. And with this, we're going to take a look at inside the pitch. What is the pitching process? What goes into it? How do people get blocked? Why do people panic? What do you do when you have anxiety? There are so many things that I'm so excited to share with you. So starting with Peter Desberg. Peter is a professional emeritus at California State University, Dominguez Hills, and recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award and Outstanding Professor Award. He is also a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in the area of stage fright and performance anxiety. Now, I know so many of you can relate with this. The author of 23 books, he has been quoted by such publications as the Wall Street Journal, Psychology Today, and the New York Times, and has consulted for companies including Apple, Boeing, and Toyota in the areas of pitching and persuasion, corporate presentations, and using storytelling and humor in business presentations. Now, Jeffery Davis. Jeffery Davis is a professor of screenwriting at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles and served from 2009 to 2019 as the department chair. Davis has also written and produced trade shows for Dick Clark Productions and counted among his advertising clients Dell Computers, Toyota of America, and Honda. He has more than 30 credits to his name, including Night Court, Remington Steele, and documentaries for A&E, Discovery, and the History Channel. As a consultant, his areas have also included writing, pitching, and employing storytelling and humor in business presentations. Welcome, Peter and Jeff. So wonderful to have you.
Great to see you, Jen. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, as always, to see you.
Oh, it is my pleasure. So now I would love for you guys, if you were walking into a room and telling people about this book and establishing like a pitch, how you would introduce yourselves. I would love for people to start to get a sense of how do you start a pitch meeting?
Okay, well, you've already heard that I'm a boring college professor, which I think most people consider redundant. And my training is as a research psychologist, which has come in handy because in this book that we wrote, one of the things we wanted to make sure of is that you're not just getting our opinions, because heaven forbid we ever get a book of our opinions, and that everything we talk about is pretty much supported by scientific research. Your tax dollars went to grants to fund the research, so it's kind of nice. So it's like your book almost. I went back years later and got a clinical psychology license so that I could treat people in one of the areas I was doing research in, which is stage fright, not how to get it, but how to deal with it. And I've written 23 books at this point.
Amazing.
Some of them actually have warning labels that say, do not read this and operate heavy machinery. But the nice thing is that in this book, we really talk a lot about stage fright, and we talk a lot about the psychology of persuasion, both of which are things, if you have a great pitch and you walk into a room and you don't feel comfortable giving it, we have a friend who we interviewed. We did a bunch of interviews for this book, and we asked her, she's won 2 Academy Awards as a producer. And we said, if somebody comes into your office to pitch and they are nervous and shaking, how does that come off for you? He says, I want them out of my office as quickly as possible. Mail it in. Don't walk into my office. Don't take my time. You know, before that puts people off too much, we talked to a friend who, if you're familiar with slam dance, he began slam dance. And he said, if somebody comes into my office nervous, all I'm concerned about is making film go farther. So I look at it as my job to make him a cup of tea, sit down and get him to be as calm as possible.
I like that. I love that. I mean, the whole idea of making someone feel safe is a very important part of the pitch process, so that things come out comfortably.
Well, you know, it's funny, Jeffrey and I talk about this all the time, that a lot of the people who are writers have a background in acting and improv, and they're great in a room. They just know how to light it up. And there are other people that say, you know, I'm much more comfortable behind a closed door and just my keyboard. And that's where, you know, that's where I'm at home, and walking into a room and talking about it, not so comfortable. And so we have a lot in the book about how they can get themselves ready to do it.
Great. I love that. I love that. And
So-
Jeff, like what was your part in thinking it? So the concept for both of you, like who came up with the concept?
You know that Peter and I have been working together for 15 years. This is our 3rd book.
Amazing.
I
was going to say, before I answer your question, let everybody meet Jeffrey, because he's the charismatic one.
So what I would say, if I were going into the room to pitch this, is that this was Peter's idea. It started, well, we'll tell you later how it actually started, but what I would really say is that my background is, I'm 3rd generation show business. I was raised by comedy writers who are a lot like wolves, except they don't mate for life. And I've really dined out a lot on that joke. Still don't know. I bring 30 years in the industry to the partnership. But let me tell you how the book began. The book began really because Peter said to me, you know what's missing from other books on this subject is the science of persuasion and stage fright. And we started to write a book about Hollywood. And then we realized, and Peter's going to tell you more about the story. Tell the Harvard story, because I think that is really cool. And how we got into this.
I'm going to build to the Harvard story, which you can imagine how low we're going to go if that's what we're building to. But I think it's interesting for people to know literally how Jeffrey and I got started. Jeffrey is downstairs in his car fuming because his son, his 8th grade son, is having a play date with my 8th grade daughter. And the kid is supposed to come down and he's not coming down. And he's thinking to himself, oh no, I don't want to go up there, ring the bell and start another, hi, my name is, and what do you do? And conversation. So finally he's forced to do that. We start talking, and within a couple of minutes, we realize we're both college professor types. And so we start talking about that. And when he told me what he did, I told him a story that one of the areas that I did research in was the psychology of humor. And a woman had called me out of the blue one day and said, I'm writing a master's thesis on the topic. Would you be on my committee? So I asked her what she's doing. She told me a bunch of really boring chapters she was going to do, and then said, but I'm also going to interview a famous Hollywood comedy writer. Oh, who? Edmund Hartman. If you don't know him by name, his name is on the cornerstone of the first Writers Guild building as his first president. He wrote like 5 of the biggest Bob Hope movies, Sorrowful Jones, Lemon Drop Kid. So I said, how do you know him? Oh, he's my dad.
I love
So
that.
so I said, well, can we forget the first couple of chapters? Can your dad get us some more people to interview? Oh, yeah. And I came up with an idea of, instead of saying, well, how did you get started in comedy? How did you know you were funny? I said, we're going to give you some problems to solve that comedy writers have to face, and we're going to watch how you work. So we did 8 interviews. I was soaring. I never had more fun in my life. I get a phone call one day. Hi, this is Susie. Bad news. I'm moving to Illinois in 2 weeks. Can't finish the project. Click. Dagger through my heart. So I decided to tell Jeffrey this story. Jeffrey says, who were some of the writers? I start telling him who the writers were, and his eyes are becoming like saucers. And he says, all those people you mentioned were around my crib playing poker with my dad.
Wow.
And literally from 20 minutes of walking in the door reluctantly as a stranger, he jumps off the couch and says, let's do the book.
All right. I love
Not like
that.
Tom Cruise jumped off the couch. No.
Yes, not like that. Not
Well,
like that.
Well, he's not the best leaper I've ever seen in fruit. But as we did this book, and we came up with, Jeffrey came up with a great alteration of the idea, which is, let's write a short comedy premise, give it to all these people, and have them write. Instead of asking them, what do you do? We'll watch them do it. And one of the interesting things that both he and I noticed was, as we were interviewing them, they kept telling us great pitching stories. And so we said, hey, it'd be kind of fun to take these and write a book about pitching.
And
finally-
it is so needed.
We're
So
finally
that
at-
was
We're finally at
excellent.
Harvard's door. And so as we're doing it, we're saying, you know, these seem almost like universal principles. And then here's this article in a Harvard research journal that says, a couple of organizational psychologists said, we're going to do the biggest study ever done on pitching. And we're going to go to the lion's den. We're going to go to where pitching is the absolute hardest thing to do. We're going to Hollywood. And Jeffrey and I said right away, like, oh, of course, these principles really work everywhere. And the idea that we got that we're really happy about is we decided to flip the idea on its head and say, since there's a huge market for people pitching, who are the people that pitch the best? The people in Hollywood. You know, if you've ever sat through a business pitch where you're seeing somebody read bullet points and you want to have the bullet aimed at their head, Hollywood has shown that in a pitch, you've got to generate emotion, you've got to generate curiosity. So there's no reason why people in the rest of the world can't figure out how to do these things that are the staple of any good Hollywood pitch.
Great. I love the idea of emotion and creating curiosity. That is fantastic. So first of all, I love the book. I think the book is brilliant. I love that there is so much in here that I'm excited to talk about. And I love that you're doing it in a way that is accessible, in a simplistic way of looking at some complex things as you take a deep dive in with persuasion and stuff. But when you came up with your initial pitch process system, what would you say you started recognizing with teaching pitching, with pitching, were the tent poles of what was working at a very high level?
Well, you just mentioned it. That's why we love working with you. You're always a step ahead.
I love working with you too.
And the thing we found, again, that, we looked, since both of us are academic types, among other things, we looked to see what was out there. And we were kind of surprised almost that nobody had really talked very much about, you could come up with the best pitch ever, and if you can't get it out and your hands are shaking and your voice is quavering, not going to do you much good. So we really wanted to put the stuff in there about how to manage anxiety, but also the literature in the psychology of persuasion is amazing. And the thing that's fascinating about it is, unlike selling, which is, the S word is a terrible thing, almost everything happens subcortically. It's all under the radar. And people generally have no idea that they're being persuaded. I mean, let me give you an example of a fascinating study.
I would love that.
There is a phenomenon called priming.
Yes. Yes.
And priming is an amazing thing. In this study, they took two groups of college students and they gave each group 5 words and said, put them together in different sentences, just make sentences out of them. And they did. And in one group, they had words like gray and wrinkled, things that sort of connote old age. And the other, it was like spry and yellow and things that implied youth. And then they said, okay, next part of the study, go down this long corridor, and the second room to the left is where the next part of the study is. But the real study was, they had their stopwatches out and say, let's see how long it takes these students to walk. The students that got the words that were young and energetic walked way faster than the group that had the gray and wrinkled words. And when they asked them later, did you have any idea that? No, this was all done unto them. They never had a clue.
So, and even and I loved your example of that in the book. So when you're thinking about, when you're entering a room and you're, as they say, warming the room up, would you say that the responsibility, let's see, sorry about that, guys, my earpods went out. So would you say that the responsibility of the writer in the priming or prepping part of the pitch is to offer something that is going to connect them?
Yes.
Would you say that also the responsibility of someone interested in hearing, part of what they need to do too is to prime the people pitching so that they feel comfortable, so that the best version of the pitch comes through?
It's funny that your audience has not seen your videos on talking about pitching, where you talk about these, they really have to. I'm sorry, Jeffrey, I didn't mean to step on you.
No, not at all. I was just going to say,
all right, everyone, we are having a sound issue. Let's see. For some reason, okay, sorry about that, guys. We had a little sound issue.
Go, you first. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Jeffrey.
Okay. So what we learned during the writing of this book is that the writer's responsibility is to start a conversation, not to sell. Because you may not, I've had many experiences over the years where I went into a room and I didn't sell the project that I wanted to, but I got a call back on something else. So the last thing in the world you want to do is sell. That's the worst kind of priming there is, because there's a wonderful story in the book about a guy who came into Toyota with a briefcase. He was in flip-flops and a Hawaiian shirt and the cutoffs or Bermudas or whatever. And he said he had a way of improving their mileage in their cars. And they're all sitting there thinking, we've spent billions of dollars trying to improve the mileage. He never took out the contents of the briefcase, right? Nobody ever saw it, and he left the room obviously without selling anything because they were put off by the fact that he didn't know how to have a conversation. I think it's that simple. And
I love what you just said there, though. He didn't know how to have a conversation,
right.
So that people are clear when you say selling is bad, as far as the intention when you're going into a pitch. Yes.
Right.
You are going into a pitch to make a relationship and to have a conversation.
Correct.
Well, you know, in some of your videos, you talk about the importance of doing your research way before you get into the room to know who the people that you'll be talking to are.
Yes.
And when you walk into the room, there are things, there's an awful lot going on when you walk into the room. And you really need to think about these before. I mean, let me give you a simple example. You're doing it right now, which I'm loving, which is you're smiling at me. You should walk into the room with a smile. Now, that sounds like a handy piece of advice, but you know what? There's research that says you take depressed people and get them to physically smile, they'll start to feel better. And it's just because of the association that comes with smiling. And when you have your face and those muscles working that way, that's associated with feeling good.
Yes.
Let me tell you about a great experiment. I love it. A group of college students was asked to rate a bunch of jokes for how funny they were. And they wanted to get one group to listen to the jokes while they were smiling and the other while they were frowning. Here's what they did. Pencil. They had one group put it between their teeth like this. Kind of approximates a smile. Another group like this. Kind of approximates a frown. 30% difference in their ratings. The ones that were smiling thought the jokes were way funnier.
Yeah.
So just walking in the room with a warm countenance, looking, there was a great study we read where piano students were judged in a recital. And the first thing, they use the same kind of equipment that people do when they're monitoring sitcoms. They had these dials and you can go, this way it's good, this way it's bad. And it's in real time all the way through. And the ones that walked in like this and they didn't make eye contact were judged as horrible. And the ones that came in like that were judged great. And those results lasted a long time.
Yes.
It colored their view of the performance. So something just that simple as you're bearing when you walk into the room, there's evidence it makes a difference.
Well, and I love that you tapped on that, because I think I always tell writers, everyone gets scared. Everyone has panic attacks in recognizing things like what I learned when I had a little panic attack. I remember 13 years ago when I first started my business, walked into a room and I hadn't prepared the first part of my introduction. I had my presentation. So like everything was there. I knew what I was going to do, but I hadn't prepared that first 5 minutes. And that created panic. And then when I recognized going into what you're saying, like I would smile at the audience and I started thinking in my brain as I'm quickly trying to recover from this, because it literally, when you go into panic, you feel like at that moment in time, I felt like someone took an eraser and erased 17 years of experience that I had at that time. And I remember being in that fear and that anxiety. And as soon as I smiled, and as soon as, and part of my anxiety was the recognition that I had a room of 100 people that I knew no one. So part of the anxiety came from, this was my first experience of not knowing my audience. So I had to, so when I smiled and when I started asking them about their log lines for their life, then people came alive. And then I felt like I knew them, and then everything worked. So I love that because I can tell you from personal experience how true that is.
Yeah,
let me tell you about another way that you were really right.
Okay.
Have you heard of a man named Daniel Kahneman?
Yes.
A book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which
yes, I have that book.
Everybody should read that book. And one of the things that he talks about is there are two ways that we make decisions: intuitively and thinking really deeply. And a lot of his research shows that when you ask people, how do you make important decisions? They all say, I think deeply, but they don't. And they go off intuition. Now, what's interesting is intuition sounds very flighty, but it's based on everything you know, everything you believe, every bias you have, and it makes you enabled to make very quick decisions. Now, if you know the people you're pitching to, and you know already what their likes are, what they feel proud of, just the stuff you were talking about in your video, then when you start talking to them, they're immediately starting to go like this, and you're starting to get them. The minute you start saying stuff that contradicts their intuition, and therefore you force them into thinking deeply, in that state, the first thing you notice is, I'm not comfortable. I'm much more wary. I'm much more skeptical. I'm harder to convince because now it's not following what I normally do. And you want to avoid getting people into that state. And it's your prep work that really lets you do it.
Yes.
So kudos for putting that in there. It's so important.
It was a learning experience. And Jeffrey, you were going to say something?
No, I was just
talking to smart people.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please, please, please.
I was just going to say that when Peter and I started making business presentations together, he had done it a long time before I started. I had worked in advertising, but I had never made presentations. We did both academic and business. I said, you know, I get really, one of the reasons that I wanted to be part of this book is I needed to read it, because I used to have terrible stage fright, and I was lucky early in my career to work for 14 years with a woman who was trained in improv and was in the old Kentucky Fried Theater before they made the movies, and before they made Airplane. But I was terrible. And so I said to Peter, give me some advice, and he did, but he said, in the end, you've got to find a way to make yourself comfortable before it starts. And this is really good advice, I think, I wish I'd thought of it, but before you actually start pitching. I was always really good in a room at parties. People used to say that, you know, I worked a room really well. I'm not sure it was a compliment.
Right.
And people would say to me, why are you nervous pitching? So what I realized was, if I went around before the presentation and I got to know the people a little bit, which goes off a lot of the things I've watched you talk about over the time I've known you, is if you get to know people, they're not strangers, and you can talk to them, if not friends, at least as acquaintances, and some of the nerves die down. Also, you can't, I don't believe that, and Peter and I talk a lot about this, if you prepared, if you've done your homework, when you're actually pitching, I don't know if you can be nervous and be pitching when you've really done the work. And that's part of what we tried to show in the book is homework is so important. And there's so many lazy people who think they should just get the job because of past credits, or, there's a great quote from Phil Rosenthal, the co-creator of Raymond, who said the reason so much television is lousy is people get by on false credits, or, so.
Yes. No, it's so
Do
true.
your homework. That's my
Do
best.
your homework, do the work. No, there are no shortcuts. You have to do the work. I love that. Now, looking at the pitch, something that I love that you guys wrote in the book was, if you don't have a problem to solve, you don't have a pitch. I'd love to hear you talk about that, because I love conflict and I love the idea of starting with a problem that has the legs to set up a series.
When Jeffrey and I first started working on Now That's Funny, we had a little discussion saying, do you think that these writers, because they're going to be developing stuff in real time, we're watching, do you think they're going to go first for character or story? And we found the answer was neither. They go for conflict. Everything came out of conflict.
Yes.
And certainly you can see in the business world, when you're making a pitch, you're basically saying, I have an idea that's going to solve whatever the issue is. Making more money, going electronic, going digital, going any of these things. It's like, this is going to help fix things. When writers deal with conflicts, it's a different ball game. And the really interesting thing to do, first of all, is getting your conflict to relate to the characters that you make them fall in love with. Because you don't care how something is going to end out if you don't care about the person it's happening to.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a big part of it. But also it's the idea of how can I get them to literally be in a situation where they're thinking, what should the solution be? They're trying to, it's like you watch a mystery, and what are you doing? You're guessing, who done it? How did this happen? And who am I going to pick as the person, waiting for the surprise to find out it's not who you thought. But all of this is relating to, as a psychologist, I look at conflict a little bit differently, because we break conflicts down into different kinds of structures, which makes it more fun. But ultimately, when we look at a conflict, it's you got to make a decision, and you put it off as long as possible and avoid it because you don't like the way it's going to be after you've made the decision. And there's always something wrong that's going to happen. Even if they're good things, if you can only have one scoop of ice cream, but the chocolate looks so good, but the minute you get close to the choosing chocolate, the strawberry looks better, you got a conflict.
Yeah.
But it's nothing like Sophie's Choice, which is,
Yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting is to set it up so that you make your audience think about what. One of the things I advise people who are talking all the time is ask your audience questions. And the best questions that you can ask are counterintuitive questions.
Mm-hmm.
Because, if I say to you, for example, we know that the Chinese seem to engage in a lot of copyright violation. What area do you think they violate copyrights most? Now, what I've done in doing that is I've gotten your involvement, because now you're going to think of an answer.
Mm-hmm.
So the minute you think of an answer, you want to know if you're right.
Right.
Now I've got your attention. Now,
Yes.
if I can think of an answer that you had no idea about, now you really want to find out more, because if you ask that question, well, what do the Chinese violate most? Most people think, oh, DVDs, they steal our music.
Right.
The real answer, Prozac.
Right. Wow. Fascinating.
Who knew? But all
Yeah.
of a sudden, now you want to find out a little more.
Because you engaged me and you included me,
Yes.
which
And
is like, I love when writers start with a question.
Absolutely. And when you've got an audience sitting there saying, I got to know what happens.
Right.
And actually trying to guess and figure it out, that's a wonderful situation to be in.
I agree. Now, you tapped on something in that, which I'd love to hear you both talk toward, is you talked about we have to care about the character.
Mhm.
So what are your tips? Because I can tell you from someone hearing thousands of pitches,
Mhm.
I find that where writers tend to ramble is with the character description. So what is your advice on pitching character?
I think I'm first gonna let Peter tell you the Peter Heller story, who was the producer manager, about why producers are needed in the room. And then I'll talk a little bit about, because I have a real problem with some of the ways in which screenwriting is taught. Not at my university, I'm not saying anything personal about anybody there, but the guru approach, you know about the guru approach. So Peter, I love the way Peter tells the Peter Heller story about, go ahead.
Well, it's nice that he says, one of the reasons why sometimes I have to insist on being part of the pitch is I'm a really good room reader. And the problem that writers get into, especially smart ones, is they're so proud of what they've come up with that if they have a really interesting, wacky third generation character who's a minor character but does these interesting twists, they want to get that out there because look how smart I am. You know, all these convoluted turns in the plot is like, what a clever thing I've done. And he says, you watch two guys on Monday morning in front of the water cooler talking about a movie, and they're going to tell you the 8 things that really stuck out in the movie. And that's what you want to do in your pitch.
Mm,
You don't want to
Mhm.
get into all of those convolutions.
right.
We want to feel the passion and the excitement
Mhm.
and create the idea of creating empathy and transformation.
Probably
Your words were never spoken.
right. Probably the reason I'm thinking of Rosalind Russell is I watched His Girl Friday the other night, and but Rosalind Russell, I think, has one of the best quotes about story and about movies, and that is, we don't remember the plot of a movie. We remember the characters and moments. And I think that's true of anything I've loved. You know, if you ask me, my favorite movie is Sunset Boulevard. If you ask me, I've seen it maybe 40 times, but if you ask me, what's the story? That's not important to me. It's the characters, it's the conflict. It's, you know, it's sort of Sleeping Beauty, really, which was their initial idea when they started writing it. But for me, this is a this is a real, I would say this is one of the things that really frustrates me in being a writing teacher, because I love it. And I don't know that you can actually teach writing. I think you can help people solve problems and get better, but I'm not sure that if someone doesn't really want to be a writer, they should be.
Right.
You know, but what I have found, thank goodness we're finally out of the early 2000s, I'm not going to mention any names, guru period, where it was all about structure.
Mhm.
And you know, I love that you asked the question about character, because again, it's like what Peter said about stage fright. You know, you can have a great pitch if you're too scared to deliver. If you don't have interesting characters and a conflict, and if the character isn't rich with something they want and something they need, which are two different things, and paradoxes to make them, and flaws, I'm not going to watch anything. That's why in so many ways I think the things we're seeing on streaming and you know, are so much more interesting than a lot of these big tent movies, which nobody I know, even professionals, is going to get to write anyway. I mean, that's a very small club.
Yes.
The things that um, I I just think that the most important thing is character and conflict, and structure will find. That's how I was taught by comedy writers: is structure will find
Yes.
you. Don't
I
start.
agree.
Don't try to
Yeah.
push the structure, and that's true of any pitch.
Yeah.
That's part of the conversation is, and take ideas from other people. Writers, I used to be this way. Writers are notoriously they can be bad at taking suggestions. If you're not
Yes,
a collaborator, you should not be in any business, but particularly show business.
I
You like,
agree.
yeah.
But Jen, I think you really put your finger on the key word when you're generating characters, the E word. If you're a good empath, you can write great characters because you have to create characters that in some way, on some dimension, you relate to. They don't have to be like you. They don't have to have your occupation. They don't have to have your gender, your height, but something in there has to connect on a very, very deep level that you shared with them. Something where I feel what they're going through. I mean, you remember we had a president who had a tagline, "I feel your pain."
right. Yeah,
The
yeah,
reason why that worked the way it did.
yeah.
And it's interesting, in our field, I had some friends that did some interesting research where they found that some people who were studying to be, in this case, it was counselors, never got the hang of it because they developed up to a point of false empathy.
Right.
That's as far as they got. And it's
Yes.
like if they had somebody come in who had a broken arm, then if they happen to have had a broken arm, they say, "I know how you feel. I broke my arm once too."
Right.
But the people that say, "Gee, this guy broke his arm," which means now he can't do things for himself. He's helpless in a way that he's never had to experience before. He's got to go to other people for help. And even if you've never broken your arm, when you felt helpless, you can relate to that character.
Right. So again, you're including the audience in what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Now, talk to me about another area that I love that you guys went into was the idea of what can a writer control when they're in a room?
Ah, I love that question. And there's a number of things. I mean, we talked a little bit already about your entrance into the room. Before you've said your first word, they've kind of made up their mind about you in a lot of ways. And by the way, as an aside, I don't know if you got to see the little thing we wrote about the sociometer.
Right.
But I
Yes.
love the idea that there's a machine this big that measures charisma.
I love that too.
And that it actually predicts. But again, establishing the mood of the room really helps. And we spoke to a number of people that said, if you're not great at that, bring in a friend. You can't see a TV show without a stand-up warming up the audience. A good friend of Jeffrey's that we interviewed, Gary Grossman, told us a story about how he had written a pilot and it had to do with martial arts. So he brought a martial artist in with him. And at one point, the pitch was getting kind of slow. So the guy took over talking while he was doing push-ups all the way through it.
Wow.
And he just said it lit up the room.
Yes.
And so sometimes it's important to know your own strengths and weaknesses. And a lot of people say, I walk into a room and I have this guy warm up the room and they tell a few jokes and they get to know everybody and get them to feel comfortable. Then I walk in and close the pitch.
Yes.
But I don't, I have somebody in there that's kind of helping me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the
Again, a
same,
good part of it, I'm sorry. Just
saying the same is true of the same person, Gary Grossman, told us that some people like to see people familiar to them, like their age group. So, bring younger people in with you. I guess the same is true for older people. If you're pitching to senior people,
also a
it
thing
makes
that,
them more comfortable. Yeah.
Mhm.
but that other thing you said, again, going back to doing your research on these people, one very nice way, you said it really great about nobody gets tired of getting compliments. So I love.
Right.
And
Yes.
just to let you know, there is research that shows that people who get complimented, even when they know they don't deserve it, like it and feel good about it.
Yes.
And this idea of, if I look at some of the work that you're really proud of, and I tell you what I liked about it, that's really good. And there is, by the way, a skill of giving compliments.
Right.
And part of what you have to develop when you give compliments is, first of all, you got to be specific. Oh, I love your work. You haven't said anything. But if you say, you have a way of having people hit bottom in such a way that your heart is breaking for this person, and then all of a sudden you see one finger move, and then a hand move, and slowly they pull themselves out because of this person that they love who came into their life. It's like that person is looking at you in a different way now. And they're saying, oh, they get my work.
Right.
They saw what I did. And it not only makes them feel good that you notice their artistry, but your stock goes up because you were smart and artistic enough to recognize it.
Yes.
So all of that are things that you can control if you've done your research.
Right.
Now, we also have a nice story in the book. An old friend of mine gave us a wonderful interview. He produced The Burbs. And at the end, he kills off Tom Hanks. And the studio said, you can't kill off Tom Hanks, he's the star. So they switched it around, and he was so mad that he didn't go to the premiere. And if somebody went in to an interview, said, oh, I noticed you produced The Burbs, loved it.
Yeah.
They just
Oh,
do.
wow.
So you
One
got
thing-
to do your research, and you need to know what they did that they hated as much as what they did and they're proud of.
There's another,
Yes.
yeah. And I think there's another thing we talk about in the book about what you have under your control. And it's fun. Oddly, I was talking to my students about this yesterday, is the mistake a lot of people make is to talk to one person. They talk to the power person in the room. Well, the person taking the notes, the showrunner's assistant, the executive assistant, you don't know where they're going to be in 2 or 3 years. But if you never look at them, Peter has a lot of research in the book about how much,
We talk about eye contact.
Yes.
how much is creepy,
Yes.
weird. But you want to make sure you include everybody. That's under your control. And
I agree. I love that.
Now,
right.
now let me,
Not enough people do that. They talk because they think, oh, this is the buyer, so.
And then you alienate and
Everybody.
isolate. And yes.
well, taking Jeffrey's idea a step further. So a week later, they have a meeting about you, and who are they going to turn to? The
Yes.
note taker, who now
Yes.
hates you, and
Yes.
they're going to sink you. But
You're right. You're right.
this question of how much control do you have has a great flip side to it. And this is another story about Larry Bresner, who just is the best storyteller that I'd ever met. And he told us a story that he goes in, the Stu Miller, the guy who wrote Throw Mama from the Train, and
Right.
they go in and they're doing a pitch to the head of New Line Cinema. So Toby Emmerich has a German Shepherd, big German Shepherd, and he's got doctor's notes up and down saying, this is my comfort dog. I can take him into restaurants, airplanes.
Yes.
So they're pitching, they're 10 minutes into the pitch, and he says, oh, you got to excuse me. I got to make a phone call. I'll be right back. As he's at the door, keep pitching. Walks out the door, and there they are. They're saying, is there a camera? Are we being punked? Is this going to appear someplace? Look at these two dumb guys. And then they decide, what the heck? Let's pitch the dog. Pitch to the dog. Toby comes back in a little later at the end of the pitch, buys it, made the
I
movie.
loved that story.
That's a great story.
It's a great story. And they were kind of wondering afterwards, like, do you think the fact that we were willing to pitch the dog kind of put things in our favor? Or did he like the idea anyway? Or we caught him in a good mood? But control is a weird thing.
Flexibility. But even like what you tapped on there, I think flexibility, being open, temperament of the room, like we've talked about, all that are so important. So what about likability? You also talked about like looking at likability. What can writers do to create likability? You talked about smiling.
Smiling
Are there
is a
other
good start.
things?
I mean, the first two things we've already talked about is liking and complimenting, or
Yes.
two really easy ways to do it. Also, it has to do with, like, one of the important factors is your credibility. And credibility is a two-edged sword. It's like, if I can get you to know my credits and they're good, that's in my favor and you're going to like me a little more. But if I sit there and list them for you, I look like I'm playing him through a trumpet and you're going to end up hating this arrogant guy in front of you. One of the things that you talked about in your videos is using self-effacing humor.
Mm-hmm.
And like anything else, there are rules for using self-effacing humor. And the main one is you can only use self-effacing humor in areas of strength. If you do it in areas where you're uncertain and weak, you make yourself look weaker. But if it's an area, if I make fun of the fact that I do a lot of research, I can do that because I do a lot of research. I'm 130 pounds. If I make fun of my strength, you don't have to laugh.
Yes, no, that I love.
I
I'm
also
sorry, go ahead.
think Nicole Fox, who is an LMU alum and is now Carl Reiner's nephew's partner, producing partner, and an old friend of ours. Nicole talks a lot about connecting. And she said, I hate iPads in a pitch because sure, someone is going to lay out a story, it's going to be interesting, but I'm not getting to know the person. So this is also true in business. People will get up, what Peter said before, people will get up, they'll do their PowerPoint, and they'll read either the exact same thing that's on the screen or they'll read something different. Both are bad. Now I'm totally confused. Again, it goes back to the conversation. If you're okay, so I was just saying that I think the most important thing you can do when you pitch is to be authentic. Don't come in with a persona. Don't pretend to be somebody you're not. You're not. Pitching and writing are not the same thing. And people know immediately. Peter's been saying this all along about likability and about, just people know. They are not stupid. They know. And they see many, many people, whether it's on Zoom or it's in person, they can tell. So that brings me to something that you do, which is sometimes known as an elevator story, and sometimes it's more related to the project. Be able to tell a story about yourself where you're not the hero. That's really,
I love that.
yeah. Well, I think it's something that you talk about, and I think not enough people do that.
Right.
They just come in. They just come in and they just sit down. It's going back to that cell thing, and I think people want to know who you are. It's the opposite of you doing homework on them. I'm guaranteeing most of the people who are out there, they know something about you too. They've done their homework. So, and when we interviewed people in other businesses, that was the thing that annoyed them the most. People either hadn't done their homework or so.
And we talked about that, so everyone knows, before we came on, we talked about the idea of what it's like to be in an interview where people are not prepared. So this is an excellent thing for everyone to be aware of. Don't go to a pitch and be unprepared. Do your research. There is no excuse right now with the internet and all of the information that you can find out. you need to go into a room and you need to know about that person, and you need to understand how to compliment, how to prime authentically, in a way of looking at what do you love that this person does. So this is a huge thing.
Yeah,
I would
there's
close
something
by saying that I have there's a quote that I love that I try to make Peter put in everything, and he wisely sometimes says, no, it doesn't really fit here. But the great Larry Kasdan, who wrote The Empire Strikes Back and you name it, dozens of movies, great movies, said being a writer is like having homework for the rest of your life. I
Yes.
think that says everything.
Yes, it does. I felt that as being a current executive and a consultant, as we all do with writers, like you will have homework the rest of your life, but you find joy from it because of the love of story and what you do. So that does make a difference. Okay, so for the last part of our interview, the thing that I think is so important is anxiety. And you guys take a deep dive into that into your book. So I would love for you to speak to the audience and tell them how to deal with anxiety in a writer's pitch.
Dimitri Martin, a really funny stand-up, has a great line where he said, just got a new apartment around the corner from Carnegie Hall. And now when somebody says, hey, Dimitri, how do I get to your new place? He says, oh, practice, 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 then turn left.
I love that. That's great.
So clearly, practicing, mucho important, that's Spanish for very important. But there's a number of things. There's a concept that we talk a lot about called state-dependent learning, which is practicing is key to be prepared, obviously, and you want to practice as close to performance conditions as possible. A great thing to do is if you're friends with, in this case, other writers who all pitch, form a little group and every so often get together and take turns pitching your projects to each other. And when you do it, simulate the feel of a room. Literally to dress the way you're going to be in the room. Have people ask the sort of questions that they've heard being asked in a room. And then do little simulations, like have somebody get angry at you. Have somebody question you very, very cynically. Have somebody criticize you, because you got to learn to be bulletproof and you got to learn how to do all that stuff. And the best way to do it, and as soon as you've done it, you critique it. By the time you think you really know your pitch, give it and video it. Because the parts that don't work well are going to show up. You'll stumble over a word or a sentence here or there. Something won't come out right. You'll find it out. Those are the areas to work on.
Right.
So all the way through, you got to do this and practice under distracting conditions. Have people, have your cell phone go off at different times. Have people bang on the door. Have somebody come in, talk to somebody else and leave. Because all these things are going to happen. And again, bulletproof. One of the great exercises we've come up with that I really like is when you really think you're ready, you really have it down, give your pitch, but first run in place really hard till you're out of breath, then give your pitch. Because that simulates physiologically what you go through in a panic attack. If you know you can get through that, you can walk into any room. You know that you're ready. But
I wish you'd tell your story about the concert, the kid who you were.
I was working with a young violinist, and teens are always fun to work with because they listen so well. So he was giving his first real important major recital. So I said to him, do me a favor, like his uniform for practice, his kid practiced at least 6 hours a day. Wonderful player. Every day, jeans or shorts, flip-flops, t-shirt. I said, do me a favor, couple of days before the concert, put on the outfit you're going to perform in. Yeah. Which means, of course, I'm not going to listen to you. You're an adult. What do you know? So night of the concert, he takes his brand new patent leather shoes out of the box for the first time, puts them on, and they are digging into his ankles. Puts on his tight cummerbund and jacket so he can no longer move freely when he plays. And then the heavy starched collar that he's got to fit the violin under to play. He screwed up right and left, distracted like he wouldn't believe. Ask me if I said I told you so. I think
I love that.
Very
yes.
good. So again,
well, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please.
So I think like the things that I want everyone to take from this is things are going to happen in a pitch. Things are going to happen where things aren't perfect, and that's okay. Just like we touched on when we look at film, when we think about structure versus emotion and story, character and conflict, what I can forgive almost anything in a story if you make me feel something and you have a powerful scene that stays with me and I understand what your intention is and what the story is about, then it doesn't matter to me where things went awry. So I think the same thing goes with the pitch. The idea of knowing where you need to master so that you are connecting and you are making people feel, and then being able to let go of what wasn't perfect.
Right. You couldn't have summarized it no better.
So, all right, I want to thank you guys. Yeah,
thank you. You've made this so much fun.
Oh, good.
And,
thank you.
You know, when we talk about a pitch as a conversation, a really good interview is a conversation, which you've made it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Peter. I love what you did in this book. Again, for everyone, Pitch Like Hollywood, which will be out in February.
In February, they're bouncing the date around. Originally, it was going to be the 15th. So we thought not in time for Valentine's Day.
Great.
The cutoff, but now I think it's the 25th, 24th, somewhere around there.
All right.
You can buy it today.
Oh, good. And also, you can pre-order right now, right?
Yeah. We just found out it's coming out on Audible too.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Excellent. Love that. All right. Well, it has been a pleasure.
Thank you again for making this so easy and so much fun.
Oh, you got it. My pleasure. You guys are fantastic. Everybody go out and buy this book. It is going to help you in your next pitch. It is going to help you understand what you need to go into the room and do, and how the conversation is going to make a difference in getting you to your outcome. This is Jen Grisanti with Story Therapy, and I want to thank you again so much for joining me, Jeffrey and Peter.
Thank you.
You've got it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You really